Yes.
We don't have anything to
I
vote
haven't
on.
heard from Ben and Julia. I know Kyle's out, and so's Tyler.
Okay.
But yeah, 4 we should be fine. As long
Okay.
as you guys all.
No one abstains.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Approving the agenda.
Yeah.
Have a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's gonna be just some of last time some stuff.
I have a whole folder of all the stuff you gave me, and it's sitting on my desk.
Feel free to send that to me
Next time.
whenever.
Oh, I meant the stuff you gave us. Like, sorry, you should have brought it back with me, but
Oh no, you're.
forget it all.
Well, I guess since our unless we can, if there's not a replacement for us, we can continue.
You'll continue,
Okay.
but
So we're trying to find a replacement.
Yeah.
and I have some updates.
Okay.
Do you have some applicants? Yes. Yeah, there's 2. And I can talk about that today a little bit. That's kind of why we've got the one agenda item, the new business item.
Okay, we good?
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to call to order the regular meeting of the NFP Review Board for Tuesday, February 25th, 2025. Nolan, will you please call the roll?
Give me a second here. Of course, the one time I need a pen. It's not one in my pocket. Okay. All right. Hollander. Here. Fuller.
Here.
Fredrickson.
Here.
Leto.
Here.
Murgia. Okay.
All right, could I get a motion to excuse absent members?
So moved.
Support?
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, agenda item B, adoption of the agenda. Could I get a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Support.
All in favor? Say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right. Agenda item C, approval of minutes. Does anyone have any amendments or comments related to the draft minutes from the January 28th, 2025 NFP meeting? All right. Hearing none, can I get a motion to approve the minutes from the January 28th, 2025 NFP meeting as presented?
So moved?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, agenda item D, public comments. Are there any comments from the public? If so, please come forward, state your name, and you'll have 3 minutes to address the board. I see no one in the audience, so how about any call-in comments?
We do not have any calling comments.
All right.
Can we make sure it's streaming? Hang on, play it stream. The only reason I'm asking is because every time I do this, it seems like they don't stream it, and I want to make sure it's out on YouTube and Facebook.
Yeah, I'll take a look.
You got it?
To
No?
make sure
Okay.
it's streaming, yep.
Okay, well, no one's working on that. We'll move to, or should I pause? Should I keep going?
No, you can keep going.
Okay. Okay. Yep. Agenda item D, board member comments. Are there any comments from the board? All right. Then let's move on to item F, new business. Number 1 is creation of a 3-member nominating subcommittee and updating the board on applications. We do have an opportunity to provide public comments specific to this agenda item. And are there any in-person public comments? I suspect no, since there's no one in the audience. And are there any phone call-in comments on this agenda item? No? Okay. Nolan, can you provide some background on this new business item?
Okay, yeah. So we have 3 board members that have terms ending in March, so at the end of March. That's Director Martin, Director Leto, and Director Fuller. So we have, since right around before the holidays, we were working together as a department to put something together to promote for a lot of different board openings. We seem to have a ton of people terming off on different boards. A lot of that promotion went out in January, and it's been consistently out there on our social media pages. For NFP specifically, we've had 2 applications come in so far. So the plan for this meeting would be to have 3 volunteers from the NFP board over the course of the first 2 weeks or so of March we'll reach out to the applicants, the 2 thus far, and we can schedule some interviews like we've done in the past with the nominating subcommittee, and then go from there, so that the hope is that at the March meeting, potentially there'd be at least 2 new board members coming in. Not to say we couldn't get another application between now and then, and we'll handle that accordingly, but having the 3 members is just sort of what we've done in the past to keep it consistent. So, that's pretty much the background. Right now, I can speak kind of broadly. The applicants are in the right background experience, so there's no issues there. New business would just be creating that nominating subcommittee, and then I can work with the subcommittee members in scheduling those interviews with the 2 applicants.
Would the phone calls be interviews, onboarding? I mean, should we think of them as interviews for the applicants, kind of the board filter, or like onboarding? Would the process have been further along on like staff approval?
Yeah, so it would be, the process would be more of an interview, and then subcommittee members would come back to the board, let's say at the March meeting, and I'd invite the applicants to come. They could give a little background. The nominating subcommittee can give some background, make a recommendation to the board, and then you guys would vote to recommend that a new applicant become a board member. Then it would go to City Commission for full approval. So there'll probably be some time past March where existing board members would need to serve potentially. Just depends on the timing with the City Commission approval, when we can get that onto an agenda. So it's usually a consent agenda item, so we have a lot of people terming on or off on boards, and so that usually ends up being a blanket approval. But yeah, I think we're a little bit ahead of where we were last year, just because finding someone in the hydrogeology field is really tough. We do tend to get quite a number of applicants kind of in the biology background or ecology, or for sure the development background. So those are a little bit easier to find potential pool applicants, but yeah, that's the process.
I'll just comment. I'd be happy to be on that 3-person committee if there is a need for that as kind of an outgoing board member. I'm happy to kind of share my experience and contribute on my way off, if that makes sense.
I'm willing to as well, and same thing as somebody going off. This could be my last hurrah, but also I participated on at least 2 other of the committees, so for what it's worth. I think we found good candidates both times, so.
Yeah, we I try to keep it I try to keep it consistent and concise too, so it shouldn't be a huge kind of heavy lift for someone on the nominating committee will usually just those interview days and not even a day, maybe like an hour, 2 hours max. And we can be flexible too. We've done those interviews virtually with applicants, or we can look for potentially an in-person at community planning and economic development offices, whatever is flexible for them.
I can help with the third if we need to, or if we need to open it up to Erin to see if she's interested. Or, I'm sorry, whoever, never mind.
Yeah.
If anyone else is interested, has been here longer. Otherwise, I can step in.
Okay. Yeah, I can't recall. I think Director Martin might have had some interest, but he's also away for this meeting. So if you'd like to serve in that role, that works too. So.
All right, are there any other questions from board members?
So our sort of categories would be the plant biology category and the water quality category, more or less, right?
Yeah,
Target.
yeah, and there's usually some crossover. There's definitely the professional experience for the applicants thus far, but also just let the subcommittee members review, and after the interview, we can debrief and come back to the board with that recommendation.
And I'm just remembering, for myself, it might be helpful for others. You were mentioning last time you had sort of a flow chart of board member category, expertise areas, and there was a spot available for a non-industry. I don't know what the term would be, just like an engaged citizen. Okay, more flexibility.
Yeah, so there's
backgrounds.
generally those 4 areas that we need to cover. And there's crossover most of the time between board members. We are also kind of entering a new stage for the board because the original board is now this year finally kind of everyone's terming off, but everybody had experience or, backgrounds in those fields. So there was a lot of crossover. But yeah, there are definitely open seats, and we're trying to, we have a new position at the city, a civic engagement coordinator. One big part of his job is to help with our election workers and election coordination. The other part is to work with some of our public boards like NFP for promotion, onboarding. He'll probably sit in on a meeting at some point this year just to get a feel for it. And so I'm really trying to promote that you don't necessarily have to be an expert or have that scientific technical background to participate in NFP. If you're really kind of interested, maybe it's a student who lives in town or a resident in any of our neighborhoods who might have a different background. That's totally fine as long as we have those core areas filled. So, and I'd actually welcome anybody to apply, even if if it's like a hobby or an interest, or maybe you volunteer on a local preservation board, or, have always thought about it but weren't sure, So. Yep, and it's the other thing to point out too is that the terms are 2 years, and you can do consecutive terms. But then you have to, after your second term, you term off, and I think you're eligible after a certain amount of time has passed if you wanted to reapply. For the initial 7 board members, there was a little bit of a staggered approach. So some had 3-year terms, some had 2-year terms to start, and that was to stagger who's terming off and who's not, just so we didn't have all 7 folks just kind of like, all right, see you, it's already difficult enough with, 2 or 3 folks leaving. So, but from here on out, it'll be those 2-year terms, you can do consecutive 2-year terms back to back.
All right. Any other questions from the board? All right. It looks like we are then looking for a motion to approve directors Fuller, Leto, and Frederickson to serve on the NFP nominating subcommittee.
So moved.
Supported. Excellent. Any further discussion or comments from board members? All right, and it looks like this will need a roll call vote. Nolan, can you please call that?
Yeah. Hollander,
Yes.
Fuller,
Yes.
Mergia,
Yes.
Leto,
Yes.
Frederickson.
Yes.
Excellent. All right, agenda item G, unfinished business. Number 1 is data discussion and draft NFP guide work session. There is an opportunity to provide public comment specific to this agenda item. Do we have any in-person public comments? And any phone call-in comments? Nope, no phone call-in comments. Okay, Nolan, can you provide some background on this unfinished business item?
Yeah, so this is probably going to be unfinished business for a while this year because check. We kicked it off at the January meeting talking about some of the data that I was looking at. You guys had some really good questions, and I wanted to follow up on a couple of the questions that were asked, and then open it back up to discussion, maybe understanding what you guys would want to look at next in terms of next meeting for, work session. What topic would you guys be most interested in discussing? So I know one of the questions that was asked, and I have the PowerPoint up from our last meeting. Let me get to this slide. There we go. So there was a question about these withdrawn categories. What was up with that? Why was it withdrawn? We don't have a lot of them, right? We have, 3. And so the one in 2020, I looked into that one. That was a withdrawn application just due to the COVID pandemic. So the project was actually initiated by the project team with city staff to put it on hold. So that is why the application was withdrawn. In 2021, we had 2. Again, one was, a project wasn't moving forward anymore. I didn't see a specific reason why, but that goes back to the original comment I had made that it could either have been a financial issue or some other issue causing that project to not move forward. We were just notified it wasn't going to move forward anymore, so that application was withdrawn. And then one of the other 2021 withdrawals was they just weren't ready for site plan yet, so there was more to talk about with the project, work through on their end. So that's where those 3 withdrawals were from. We don't usually have that situation happen, at least for the NFP projects. I guess I can't speak overall. A lot of these projects have really complex funding mechanisms that sometimes can cause issues and conflicts with our own site plan process. Same thing goes with, state or federal regulations. It really varies. So each project is kind of, it varies quite a bit in terms of why it might move forward, why it might not. I've also seen, since I've been around the NFP board since 2019, so kind of crazy, but since the beginning, I've seen a lot of projects maybe start in a year but end in a different year. So you can actually see, there's under review. There's a couple projects still under review from 2023, and that's most likely either they were given extensions because they requested an extension, or they were in the process and something else is slowing it up, but it's still, going through our development process right now. So hopefully, 2023 under review will close out this year. Sometimes it takes longer. It just depends. The other question that was brought up was, basically of the NFP, projects that have come through site plan, what percentage of those have had variances involved? And I think I talked about it a little bit last time. The use variance, I included it just, to share that information, but that has less to do with the actual physical standards from NFP. That's more like, it's zoned residential, so we have to, either rezone it or maybe they're changing a use and they're looking for that variance. The dimensional variance is more about like on the ground stuff, and that is where, we're talking about like a variance from the protected tree standard or the woodland standard, the wetland standard. So right around 39% of the total projects that have come through site plan have had a dimensional variance involved. I still haven't broken it down by like size of project or type of project yet, because there are some projects that have multiple of these planning, zoning, enforcement cases on our end. And then 24% had that use variance, which again is kind of maybe you can kind of separate bucket from NFP, deals with other aspects of the project or the site, or zoning. So, it's something that moving forward with our new development process that I went over at our previous meeting, we're trying to streamline our process and get ahead of connecting with folks on the project ideas they might have or any potential issues they may run into or challenges they might run into with a site. As an example, recently, there's someone interested in some NFP properties for a certain type of development, and I was able to talk to them about how they might, I can't give advice on how they reconfigure it. That's really up to them as well, but I didn't want them to just think of NFP as a de facto, you need a variance to get this project done. There's ways to implement the project without necessarily having to go for variances. So we really try hard to not go for these variances. There are some sites, though, in town that are really challenging too. And if I broke it down even further, I have a feeling that a lot of the dimensional variances were probably from slopes, protected slopes, which is for some of the original board members, that was a kind of a tricky standard to work through initially when NFP was, coming to fruition. But I remember those two questions specifically from the previous meeting were ones I kind of wanted to follow up with you guys on. Were there any questions related to those two topics?
As we look at that percentage, is anything gleaned from as far as like going forward, if this is probably going to be the average, or is there changes to be made to our zoning ordinance, or not zoning ordinance, the guidelines for NFP to minimize that, or it's an interesting number, but are we using it to affect any kind of change either way, or?
Yeah, it's this is the first time that I've been able to take a look back in time and see how this is all played out. I think moving forward, it will be something to take a look at and try to understand, what might be involved in terms of the ordinance and see where some of those conflicts might be. Again, I think a lot of I can take a deeper dive into what these dimensional variances were requested for, because we have that documentation. I do believe, though, that a majority of them would be for slopes. I can think of a few that maybe were like protected trees. There's also been some discussion about situations where maybe there's restorative action taking place on a property, and a variance is still required to potentially impact that area to implement restorative actions. That's kind of a little bit of a gray area. So I think moving forward, I'm going to work with our zoning administrator to just understand how we can make it so that NFP doesn't always equate to a variance. I mentioned at the January meeting, but when we had our new website go online, one of the first things we didn't really catch was that when you go to the NFP webpage, you didn't see, the first thing you saw was apply for a zoning board of appeals, apply for a zoning variance. So naturally, when people just keep seeing that every time they go to that website, the first thing they're seeing isn't even the NFP application. It's the variance information. So we've actually updated that, so that's not what you see. You see the application, you see some site plan information. So hopefully that helps clear things up. But we also, again, we're trying to have conversations with a developer or a resident who has an idea for a development ahead of time, so that we can give them the information they need, and then it really becomes on them to potentially reconfigure the site to adhere.
Yeah, the only other thing I'll add is it would be interesting to understand if these are mostly slope, how many projects that are triggered for NFP for slope, how many of those end up being variances, you know what I mean? We almost always ended up with a variance on that, because that could probably say something about how we need to look at our code. I know it's more dives for you.
No, and I'm happy to, like I said, we, for many years, NFP wasn't tied to our assessing software until very recently. And so we've got the NFP properties called out in our assessing software, so we can go back and look at these processes and get this data and understand where the conflicts are without, we have something to back it up a little bit more with, what's going on. Why did we see so many variances in 2022? Why do we continue to see variances for slope? So that is the natural next step, is to take a look at each of the variances and kind of walk through where the conflict was. It could be that it really was a very challenging site, because as you all know, a lot of sites don't have just one natural feature. Some do, but most have two. Some have three or more, and so that can be really tricky to navigate for a site layout without, sometimes you're basically picking what conflict am I going to run up against. If you're looking at slope protection, oftentimes you got woodland, or you have slope that is, connected to a water body. And so that's where I think it can get kind of tricky. Because there might actually be a real case that says, I really don't have any other place to put the structure I'd like to put here, or without impacting something. And there's a lot of parcels in town that are they're low intensity uses, so they might have been a single family home at some point, or they haven't been developed yet, where if someone is looking to develop there, that might be really difficult to do. But yeah, I'm open to taking a deeper dive into the data more.
Nolan, the use variance wouldn't be tied to the language that we have in NFP that talks about reasonable use or reasonable, forget exactly what the wording is, but it's around like a reasonable use for that function that the developer, the applicant is applying for. Just thinking back to the country club project, and that was a big question as so if you don't have a driving range, but you have a 9-hole golf course, is that a reasonable, when can we ask them to work around it because and how much is the site, impinging on the ability to use that reasonably? And there's, 1,000 different uses and you can't really be an expert in all of them. So I remember that use piece being a big hang up for that one.
Yeah, I will say the NFP ordinance does talk about, right, kind of at the beginning, that if there's a conflict between like the base zoning and the NFP overlay district, that the NFP overlay district kind of overrides. The only case, yeah, like you said, that I can think of in the recent past is the country club. I haven't seen a use variance like you're mentioning where NFP had a conflict with, I can't reasonably use this site now because NFP is, or because there's natural features on the site. But that's a good point. I mean, we have in our zoning ordinance, we have a use table that outlines, if you're zoned to this is the types of uses that are prohibited. These are the types of uses that are allowed.
Right.
But for NFP properties, I don't think there's been, there's mostly the NFP projects have been some type of commercial zoning or residential zoning. And I haven't seen a case yet come through, or I could look into it, but I don't remember anyone coming through where it was like they couldn't use the site reasonably for what they wanted to because of NFP. So there wouldn't have been a reason necessarily to, NFP equating to like a use variance. I think the country club was the closest, and that was figured out without a variance process. So they did have dimensional variances though,
right?
Because there was a lot of natural features on the site existing. So
I'm interested in, I don't think that we've seen one yet, but I'm interested in tracking any sort of instances where a variance request is linked to some other cross-cutting requirement from state or federal funding sources, or Eagle comes to mind in particular, because a lot of these sites are both NFP and brownfield. And an example that comes to mind is if you have significant soil contamination that you need to remediate, and because of that, it's going to mean you're going to have to take out a noteworthy tree or something like that. I can think of an example from ZBA that's not NFP, which was that we were doing a project that we were trying to figure out the parking, and the state requirements for the parking were we had to have a minimum number of parking spaces for a project, and that minimum was more than the maximum allowed by city zoning. So we had to get a variance to kind of meet in the middle, and that was entirely due to cross-cutting regulations and financing. And I think we're going to see those at some point. I'm not personally worried about every project is a unicorn, really. And so when we have these very specific instances where the site is challenging in a certain way, I think it's interesting to hear about it and keep track of it. And I think we should track that data. But for me, the issue becomes when we know that there's something that is going to be some sort of barrier to somebody proceeding with a project because there's a mismatch between what we're doing and some of the other requirements they have to meet. That's where I think we have to be really thoughtful.
yeah, and I think this year might be a good year to review the ordinance and understand where those conflicts might exist. Right now, like with your Eagle example, a lot of it in the ordinance, the language just kind of points to, you still need these to look at if you need these permits from I think even in the ordinance right now, it's MDEQ, so that in and of itself just shows you that it needs to be updated because we don't even have Eagle called out correctly. But those are minor changes, and then we can take a look at any of those, like you're saying, examples where there might be like, you use a good example like brownfield, like, yeah, there's going to be a ground disturbance if there's remediation activities. Or, you know, another example, like I mentioned, is say someone's restoring wetlands, right? They have to impact it, the feature, to actually help restore it to some extent. And as it's written kind of right now, at least from what I can recall without looking at it directly, you know, that would be a variance process still, like you're saying. So that is a step that, I mean, is that really something that needs to occur? Like, is there some way to take a look at the ordinance language, maybe add, you know, a situation where, okay, they're doing remediation activities, so that is you know, an activity that's allowed, right? The tricky part that inevitably ends up with zoning or the NFP ordinance itself is just if we get too specific, then there isn't that not freedom, but the ability to interpret these certainly some very gray scenarios when it comes to projects and what the work is and what the zoning says, right? So, yeah, I'm open to taking a look at. I've already started kind of on my end looking at the ordinance for the small details, so definitions, just calling out the right regulatory agency. We talked about it a little last time. I think Director Murgia talked about it, but like maybe that repository of, you know, contractors that we can maybe point to. Like, we're not creating the list, giving you a recommendation, but we're saying this resource exists. You can go here to learn, to find, you know, or look at a certified arborist, or, you know, we're not making a direct recommendation, but here's a good place to start, right? So I think your point is kind of trying to lower some of the barriers and not make it more arduous than it needs to be. And your example too is for very, you know, lots of complex projects that bigger projects will involve brownfield most of the time. But to be fair, most of the city probably is dealing with some level of contamination just due to its age and its history of industry. So
I think it's a good example though to kind of anticipate the conflict, especially around parking and space needed for other city requirements, are what I'm remembering primarily where we had conflict with, because I think that, you know, we're being asked to make an exception on the ordinance, and sometimes another ordinance is they're abiding by that one, and therefore, and so there were some cases where we could ask, well, could they consider, you know, flexing on that ordinance? And there's a bit of a back and forth. There was one where they were asking to take out some trees because they required parking, and I think they went back to the city officials and they actually had some flexibility on it and were able to not need an ordinance. The other one I'm thinking about was a big housing project where they needed access for fire safety rescue, and it's like, okay, we're not gonna probably ask for a ton of flexibility on that. But yeah, that definitely happened several times. We're kind of feeling out, well, ours is a requirement as well, so it shouldn't be assumed totally different values, you know, safety, environment, quality of life, convenience. So it's kind of hard to compare them, but usually safety wins, I would say. But
yeah, and the most common one I feel like the board interacts with is landscaping, because there's landscaping and screening standards in the zoning ordinance itself, the zoning code. Then there's obviously NFP has more stipulations about this is prohibited plants we don't want to see. And we'd like to see natives, although there is a stipulation, and the board has used it in the past to say, well, we can approve a certain a certain list or group of non-native species, as long as it's adhering to the fact that like they're going to be isolated in certain areas on the site and not just mixed with native plantings, so that you reduce the chance of, issues occurring. And it's also been brought up, that's another interesting one too, because natives can be really hard to obtain locally from nurseries. Even the city itself will have a hard time getting certain native tree species for our right-of-way plantings every year. Just inevitably, demand was super high for a while there, and then nurseries couldn't really, catch up. And so there's also, it was mentioned, but, it can be, there's a lot more that goes along with implementing natives on a site versus non-natives, non-invasives. I should make that distinction too: non-native, non-invasive species, because we don't want invasive species. But yeah, sometimes there's. I think that's where NFP is a good check, right? Because they come forward and maybe on the planting list, right, there's an identifiable shrub that in and of itself isn't invasive, but it might attract an insect or something that can damage, not just it, but other native species or other, plantings on their list. So
And one other thing I wanted to jump off Hollander with the mismatching sometimes of use in NFP sites. And I do wonder about a very extensive NFP site that's got a lot of triggers and picture all the different stipulations overlaying what that actually leaves for space for use. And if we need to look at if there's certain like subsets within the overlay district that certain uses don't make sense, even though they're allowed right now. But when it comes down to it, we're going to have to do a variance anyway. And if that's what we want to do, then why are we, what I mean? Like, it's kind of like, are we just.
Yep. Yeah, and we've worked quite a bit the past year or so with like a lot of the citywide rezonings. So we had the commercial rezoning work. We have residential stuff coming at some point. And that's to alleviate a couple things. We had some zoning, like zoning districts that weren't really being used or just didn't make sense anymore. So we could either combine them or, just make it a little easier for people to interpret, or it makes more sense for a certain site. We're also, the second part of that is we had some pretty bad like split zoned properties, which can make things tricky. Like if it's 3/4 residential and then the other quarter is showing as a commercial, right? So there was some split zoning stuff. I will say for NFP, there's a lot of properties in NFP that are RS5, so that's single family residential. A lot of those projects that like a regular homeowner is going to undertake don't really require full NFP board approval. And if it doesn't require site plan or permits, we really aren't. Those are the two mechanisms that I can use for reviewing something. But, if they're doing work that doesn't require either of those, I'm not really involved, right? There are some instances, maybe if they're doing a retaining wall and they pull a building permit, then that might be an admin review situation. Still hasn't been very frequent. The other situation has been like the cell towers in town. Kind of a funky situation. They might be at like the back of a property that's, an NFP property, and there's lots of natural features around it. But they're working within this like fenced in area for the tower, and we kind of interpret that as like you're doing interior work. You're only touching the tower. You're just bringing equipment to it. You've already got a built up area where you'll stage equipment and vehicles. And then, so that doesn't really require, they sign off and say that they're not impacting any features, right? So we do have that. So my point is that with like the zoning situation, usually it's the large projects that you'll see come forward. Maybe sometimes they've had some of those weird zoning, like split zoning issues, or they were zoned like something counterintuitive to what the development needs or is wanting to pursue. Yeah, there's 4 on the table here. There's 4 from 2019, 4 from 2022, and it kind of took a drop in the years in between. So I can look into, what those were requests for and come back to the board just to, take a little bit deeper dive. And that will connect to, maybe some of like looking at the site and then looking at the ordinance and see where was the friction. But yeah, so I'm stop rambling, but overall NFP right at the beginning where if there's a conflict between the base zoning district and NFP kind of takes the ball. That's the one that takes precedent, which is where there's been some of those issues, like with planting lists. And I think it was worked out in the moment when applicants came to the board. The example being, I think Friendship Village was a good recent example. Talking about like certain trees in parking lot, some of the landscaping challenges they had with wanting to have non-natives in certain areas versus not.
One other thing that I was thinking about with variances, and I don't know if it's possible to track this or capture this anywhere in the process, but I feel like there have been several applicants who meet with you or other city staff or come to us for a first look where we're not voting on anything, but they sort of come and present to us and end up altering their plans before they even get to the point of a variance, just through contact with the board or you. So again, I don't know if it's capturable, but it'd be interesting to know how many variances we avoided just through the process.
Yeah, I like that. And that's part of this whole pre-development process is really like you got something pie in the sky, an idea that you really want to pursue, but you're not really sure where to start. You start here, and then we will work with you until you have kind of a defined scope. And then once you have a defined scope is when you move through the process and into checklist, site plan review process, right, which is where things start to get more nitty-gritty into the code. Now, the tricky part is usually that if someone's requesting a variance, they can't start site plan until a variance is complete. So I think there's some overlap you can like apply, but it's a little bit in limbo until, if there's an identified variance that someone is wanting to request, they have to go to NFP first, then ZBA. If things go well, then after that, they can move through the site plan process, which, again, that's another incentive, I think, like you're saying, is to when we touch base with them earlier and we can maybe avoid that situation, because the way NFP and ZBA interact right now, it can add a month or two on to a project schedule just based on how the meetings line up and the noticing requirements for each. Because for NFP, there's a requirement, you have to let property and taxpayer, owners of those properties know within 300 feet of that property, project. It's the same thing for ZBA. So basically there'll be notice going out twice. but for different regulatory bodies.
And that's the minimum delay when
Correct.
you're doing the overlay. And there's kind of like the applicant has a reasonable case for why they would need a variance, and through working with staff, you're able to help them find, another path that allows them to do their project without having to request a variance. There's also the case where the applicant doesn't know if they need a variance or not. Like I was in that situation with Woodland a couple years ago. We didn't know if we had a woodland because we didn't know how to do the tree report. And there's been enough time now that I think it's easier to give recommendations to applicants and just talk to this person, talk to that person. But that is another reason why I sort of push for the directory approach, where it's like you don't have to use these people, but here are some local people that you could work with to answer this question that
Right.
so that you can figure out if you need a variance or not. And if you do think you need a variance, then we still should be trying to push them down a path that doesn't require a variance. But that in and of itself, I mean, for us, that added like 2 months of delays to a project.
Right, and that's what we want to avoid for sure. And that's another justification for the NFP guide being robust as well, is like another thing alongside the actual ordinance itself as a resource. So if I'm meeting with someone, say someone is like, hey, I've got a couple properties, they're pretty wooded, I'm not sure, I want to do some like housing development there, but I'm not sure, there's some slopes too, they'll be working with PJ in our office through the pre-development process, and PJ will connect with myself and Pete Eldridge, our zoning administrator, and I can give, background on those properties. So I still have like the slope layer, and we can look at aerial imagery and kind of provide some early guidance on things for them to look for. And I like to provide like links to the code as well, so people can just easily click and they go right to the, the spot in the code they need to see. I think that once the guide is really ready, and I've updated it a little bit too since the last meeting with like calendars, updating some more of the language, so I can get that copy to you guys. But yeah, I want to be able to, like, at the end of that meeting, even though it's not site plan yet, I want to have it be like the sort of a deliverable that I can, like, hey, check this out, please. We talked today. I got a little bit of a summary for you, but please look at the guide. And it's supposed to be a lot easier than just, if you go in and look at a zoning code, as a regular person, you're going to be like, I'm not doing homework today. So.
Do you think, to Director Hollander's point, do you think for each of the natural feature categories or sort of actions that an applicant might have to take, even if it's like compensatory, like you were talking about, tree shortage in certain categories, whether the city could put out like an RFP or something like that for businesses in that field to say, this is the type of service that we'd like to at least have a listing of what we said, qualified professionals, I think, for woodland delineation. And is this something that your business would like to put your name on here as a viable, so that like in your situation, you could say, what is that? Well, here's a list of people you can help. We're not endorsing anyone specifically. And same for trees too, because we have a tree planting group in the Vine neighborhood, and we don't have trouble getting native trees, but people typically like to see the really big ball and burlap size. So even within that, that's sort of like an industry quirk, and you could still have a much larger list of nurseries that supply those. But, wetland delineation, woodland delineation, tree, sourcing, native plant sourcing, all these things that are sort of attached to the landscaping standards or what we define as the natural features themselves, could be really handy and take a lot of the guesswork and communication out of it from your end and for applicants.
Yes, and I did actually, I asked some staff about that. I haven't approached our attorney's office yet to understand like what we can, because before, I think I mentioned it, if we supply a list, that's a no, right? Because then we are in a position where we're basically recommending certain people. We can't do that. But if we can point to an already existing resource, so like I think Director Murgia talked about it at the last meeting, and I think I've ended up finding it, but Eagle they're already starting to kind of build a list of people for various like permits and compliance, type resources. So who can help me with making sure I am in with I am in compliance. And there's actually an area where you can reach out to Eagle and ask to be added to the list, right? So if you're not added to the list, so it's something we could actually bring up. We just did this year too, but we met with developers in town. Like we had a summit that we invited developers to, a lot of the major companies here in town. That could be something to share with them. Like, did you know you could add add your company to this list, right? And then this is these are some pages from the actual guide. And so I think to your point, Director Hollander, having like a where do I start? How do I do this? Even just something basic like I've got set up like right here. And this is still very, early draft, but like, parcel boundaries just generally like, a woodland goes across those, right? Like where do I start? What resource do I use first to look into, potentially if I do have a woodland, right? Under the professional review, that might be where we could link to an existing resource, right? So that someone could check that out.
A question about the no list. The city does have a system to do like an RFQ. I know we do it for like engineers and stuff. So like, it's basically like you have to be pre-approved to work with the city. I'm not saying linking out wouldn't work, but I am struggling a little bit to think about local nurseries and things and what kind of list that would actually be living on. So I wonder if it's reworded. It's mostly just a way to vet people beforehand rather than recommending. And I know that comes with liability. It's more like saying everyone meets our qualifications that's on this list. They know what a native is. They grow this many trees. They are located in whatever radius
Or could you demonstrate objectivity or like lack of bias through if there isn't a group that has like, say, native trees available or something like that maintains a list of that, but you still want to have one. Yeah, could the city demonstrate the lack of bias or objectivity by blanket asking anybody who would like to be on the list to, I don't know how, I know sometimes the RFP, it's like you contact 3 or more eligible, kind of contractors or whatever the project might be, and others are more formally posted in places for anybody to go see.
And I need to ask just a better series of questions, maybe just sit down for an hour and ask our attorney's office some more questions, because we do have things that the city hosts, right? We have minority and women contractor list as an example. That's something that we've built that people can go use as a resource. So I don't know what exactly on the legal side, like why necessarily, like I just want to know what we can do, what we can't do. Then when we figure that out, we can implement what we can, right? And maybe it is some of the ideas you're mentioning. I hadn't even thought about, an RFQ process, so that's a good point. But, and it most likely will live in a document like this versus the actual ordinance. But again, that's something I can ask attorney's office about.
my personal experience this kind of stuff would be extremely helpful.
Yeah, I mean, even at the developer summit, and we had a lot of folks from various, engineering, architectural, backgrounds who were not comfortable with NFP. They walked up to my table and they're like, eyes are wide, and I'm trying to calm them down, and I'm just exaggerating, but. They did find the idea of a guide type document super helpful, because they've also run into not issues, but they've run into challenges with NFP because it's not something that they necessarily always see in other communities they work in. So it's that added bit that, as NFP has kind of grown on its own, right, since its early days. Because trust me, 2019, I don't think there were any NFP cases. It was all training for the board and staff, and it's been kind of growing pains since then. And I think we've finally kind of hit the stride recently, like last year, maybe the year before, till now, like kind of after COVID and everything else, where we've been able to have enough cases where we can have that retrospective review as a part of like the phase 3 work that was supposed to be more on the, like promotion conservation type spectrum. And I think the guide still fits into that we're trying to build the stewardship for everybody. So having this document be accessible and with as much resources as we can pack into it will be a net positive. At least that's how I see it. So, and yeah, I didn't get a chance at the last meeting to show kind of what the guide document looks like. It's varied a little bit. It was started back in 2020-ish, I think. Jamie had started it, the previous NFP board liaison had started it with some other staff, and then it kind of hit the back burner because there was the phase 2 map and all the edits that were, part of that took precedent. But basically what it does, or what it's meant to do, is really introduce people to what it is, what the NFP overlay ordinance is, and then take a deep dive into the individual standards. So this is showing woodlands. And it would go through wetlands and water resources, slopes. It also has sections about how to prep for a meeting. So that's another thing that we learned a little bit through the process. I think part of it was shifting from the community room into here, but bring a USB drive as a backup, send an email to staff with your presentation or extra materials, come ready with your computer if you'd like to hook up to our, come early. Just this small stuff that like sometimes isn't as well known, like where to park. It gets to the nitty gritty of like even some of the stuff that, applicant did really well with the ordinance, but like, what are other ways they can prep for the meeting, come ready for your questions as a board. So really meant to be comprehensive and go beyond just the standards and guidelines from the ordinance, which is where I think we can add extra resources. We kind of have some guiding documents now for that new development process, especially for site plan. And we do have some one-pagers as an example that link to other resources, right? So we are moving that direction of just not hard ordinance stuff anymore. We're trying to have these other resources to be accessible. Because my hope is that, regular old resident who might be interested can just pick it up and go to the woodland section and have a basic understanding of what they might need to do. and I'm still, I'm still available to talk to as a resource. That's no problem. Maybe they don't want to talk to me. I don't know. Maybe they want a guide that can help them and then move forward from there. But and
No one-
yes, that's what I have.
I was just going to ask, are you looking for feedback on this draft at this point, or do you want to get a little farther along? I mean, not necessarily in the meeting, but I know you sent us a draft, and I wrote a few comments.
Yeah,
but-
if you want to individually send those to me, 'cause
Okay.
I am actively working on it. And my hope is that it can be a resource that is available this year.
Great.
There's no hard deadline for that either. That's just the hope.
But we'll
but-
see another draft at some point.
Yeah,
Probably.
because like I said, I took some of the comments from last meeting about, adding a calendar specifically. So I've got that there so that people can visualize some of the timing they might need. Goes back to that, like, how does this interact with other city processes? So, yeah, and I can bring the updated copy next time.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'll email you the things I found.
Yeah, and yeah, email me individually
Yeah.
with those comments.
All right. Any other board comments on the NFP guide or data discussion? All right. Agenda item H, staff reports and updates. Looks like,
Yeah, I don't really have anything. I know some of you might be involved in Imagine Kalamazoo 2035. That's still moving forward. So engagement is going to kind of pick back up in April and March and April. So just a reminder, that's still moving forward. So maybe I'll see some of you at some of the upcoming meetings, but I wanted to include that.
all right. Agenda item I, communications and announcements. Any communications or announcements from board members? All right. Hearing none, I believe we are adjourned. And a one shot at the gavel.